This meeting, as usual, will be broadcast live, recorded for playback on the Council's YouTube channel. Will anybody else be recording the proceedings? I ask just so that people at the meeting will know if this is happening. Councillor McKay.
If I may record my right to.
Perfect, thank you. Moving on then to if the fire alarm sounds during the meeting, please remain seated. Members of the Democratic Services team will assess the situation and give some further instructions on the evacuation of the building if necessary. Moving on then swiftly, we've got item number 1, which is apologies for absence. Apologies have been received from Councillors Harper, Higson, Parfitt and Cook. Can I check if there are any other apologies? Can't see any. Item 2, substitute members. Can I see the hands raised? I'm going to go round clockwise. So, Councillor Burke.
Councillor Burke for Councillor Parfitt-Reid.
Thank you. Councillor Reardon.
Councillor Reardon for Councillor Cook.
Councillor Gooch.
Councillor Gooch for Councillor Harper.
Anyone on that side? Yeah.
Councillor Conyard for Councillor Higson.
Lovely. Thank you. Is that everyone? Yep. Item 3, we don't have any urgent items this evening. Item 4, we've got some cabinet members, but I can't see any other visiting members in the gallery. So I don't know if you don't need to announce yourself. Councillor Forecast was hoping to be here, but he's very sick. So I don't think, anyone would want him here. And he's actually quite sick that we can't watch him on the virtual viewing either. I've got a statement somewhere on there that he wants me to read out when he would normally be here visiting members. Can I just check that the committee is agreed with that? Lovely, thank you. Item 5, are there any disclosures by members and officers? No, can't see any. Item 6, are there any disclosures of lobbying? No. Item 7, I propose all items be taken in public. Is this agreed? Item 8, there are no petitions this evening. Item 9, there's no questions from local residents. Item 10, we don't have any questions from members, which moves us on to the one item on the agenda, which is agenda item 11, which is the receipt of a call-in for the decision based around Maidstone and the link decarbonisation. Firstly, the report will be introduced by the Democratic Services Officer.
Good evening, members. This report outlines development procedure in relation to the call-in received concerning the Maidstone and Link decarbonisation decision. The committee is asked to consider that decision against the call-in request received, which is outlined in Appendix 1 to the report. The available options to the committee are outlined in Section 3 to the report. These are to either agree that no further action is required, or recommend an alternative decision for consideration by the Cabinet, or recommend that the decision be reviewed by full council. We're happy to take any questions on procedure.
Thank you very much, Cassie. So the members that called in the decision was myself, Councillor Parfitt and Councillor Harper. So first of all, to go through the reasons for calling in the decision, it was finally made at the Cabinet public meeting, during which no Cabinet members made any comments regarding the project. It was just agreed. We all felt that the report was quite thin. In particular, paragraph 2.11 states that the notional return is less than the Council's current target rate of return in its capital strategy of 5%. You'll see in your papers that it's actually 1.9%. Paragraph 4.2 states that further work is required to obtain definitive costs for the project. So we were mindful that we're not yet at a position where these are the final costs for the project. Paragraph 2.10 says the costs have increased by 1.545 million, which is a 41% rise, with not much detail as to how these costs have actually increased. So we wanted a bit more reasoning about whether we thought that was justified or acceptable. And then paragraph 2.11 didn't give any indication where the additional Maidstone Council contribution of 2.074 million will come from. It doesn't indicate how the revenue financing of the costs will be met, and we were worried about where the compensating cuts for that would be made. So that was, firstly as well, with this report, it does say the wards affected are High Street, but I think it's probably better to say that it does affect all wards, being that it is a council owned property. So if we could probably just make that comment. And then just a couple of other ones from me before I kick off, because these are the questions that I'd really like to ask. I think before we start the actual discussion, it'd be a really good idea to get the actual financials of the project, just so that we're all starting from a level playing field. So whoever wants to explain that, I don't mind, but obviously we've got the Salix grant, which is central government money. We've slightly got that ring-fenced area of the CELEP grant, which is for the floor 4 area. And then we've got the council contribution, obviously, to make up the bulk of the project improvements. And I think we all need to come from a level playing field on the Scrutiny Committee about where that money is coming from and the financing of that. And then, because I think that's a lot to do with the reasons for the call-in initially as well. Obviously, it does say in the report that members may conclude that the project offers strategic benefits, which may justify the implicit revenue subsidy arising for the project. I think also the report was a little thin on potential for alternatives. So where we're spending this money, is there anything else that would be a better spend of the money? So I'd like to hear if there were any other considerations from the Cabinet about whether we could have bought social housing with the money, which would obviously give us an asset going forwards, bearing in mind that this all comes from the same capital expenditure line on the capital budget. This will have impact for potentially other green projects. So what the thought process behind that was, is this how you felt this was one of the more important projects to go ahead with? So I think that is probably it from me, but I have also forgotten to read out Councillor Forecast's visiting member. What did he say? So again, his apologies that he can't be here this evening. Green energy and decarbonisation are important and should be aspiration goals. However, the UK contributes a mere 1% of global emissions. Given the current economic climate, MBC should be preserving taxpayers' money on more real-life issues such as local housing, reducing the council tax burden, and regenerating our town centre and keeping car parking fares froze. The projected return on investment of 1.9% is below the council's target of 5%, with no notable strategic benefits after spiralling costs. This decision is not inconsequential. This decision is an inconsequential and not costed vanity project. I urge colleagues to oppose it. So that's his statement. So perhaps if I could move over to either Councillor Summersgill or Councillor Jeffrey to just give me the lead on the questions that I think we should go through as a base for the committee's understanding. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Russell. By way of establishing the background to this project, it's now over 1 year since the previous Cabinet approved the Net Zero Pathway document in July 2023, which included the carbon dioxide emission reduction feasible for Maidstone House of 362 tonnes within a total CO2e for Maidstone Council properties of around 800 tonnes. So Maidstone House comprises about 40% of the Council's emissions. With Cabinet approval at that time and strong encouragement by the then Council leader, MBC applied for and received a Salix grant in excess of £3 million to be expended on Maidstone House and the link. A grant notified at the end of 2023 and has to be fully expended by March 2025. Otherwise, the £3.25 million of external funding to the Council will be lost. Progress since the end of 2023 over the past 6 months has been that of firming up the design details, reviewing several technical aspects, and liaising with planners over elements of the building visibility. Necessary changes to cladding and waterproofing amount to a significant part of the cost changes. The Council has a leading engineering consultant, Calford Seaton, advising and working on all aspects and ensuring that appropriate technical and contractual decisions are being taken. It is envisaged that this project would not only be an exemplar to highlight what councils can do to their estates, but will also lead to lower maintenance and replacement costs of our future budgets, as well as the energy cost savings. on the basis. As is often the case, capital expenditure now for annual savings later. An uncosted benefit is also that it will be more attractive to renters to occupy a property of this standard.
Councillor Jeffrey.
Thank you, Councillor Russell. Yeah, I'm not going to say a huge amount, and I know Mark's going to come in with some of the technical finance bits, but just to say, and to respond to one or two of the points raised, I mean, we are in a climate emergency, and yes, we have to do everything possible to mitigate against that, but we also have to adapt to the future and make sure that our estate is as carbon free as it possibly can. In this case, decarbonisation is the way to do that, and to insulate against both heat and cold. You mentioned specifically around the asset that we may be foregoing. Obviously, this gives us an asset. We lease the building on a long lease, but we own the building for all intents and purposes, and by investing in it, we do end up with a better asset. So that asset is important, and we have got a huge, as I'm sure you remember, a huge amount set aside for social housing, council housing, and that remains untouched, and we remain absolutely committed to that. My biggest concern is the timing on this. We've got 3 million of grant from Salex. We have to spend it by the end of the year. If we don't, we've lost that 3 million. And that feels to me like a fairly overriding point to make sure we do deliver what will be an outstanding development or contribution to our estate. Mark, do you want to?
Yeah, thank you, Mark Green. If you could possibly just get a bit more into the financing of the council's proportion that we'll be putting forward, so that 2723464. Thank you.
Yeah, so first of all, on the point about the financial return that the project generates, it generates a return of 1.9%, which is less than the council's target rate of return. By all means. Yes, as Councillor Russell has said, the return on this project is 1.9% of the amount invested. Normally we look for a return of 5%, but the council's capital strategy allows us to go ahead with projects that meet overriding strategic priorities, and the climate change agenda, as agreed by council, and the biodiversity and climate change action plan sets this out, shows that this is a priority for the council, and the amount that's being spent on this project is affordable within the overall envelope that was agreed by members when setting the budget in February of this year. The project is now, we project, going to cost more than originally anticipated, but we have the flexibility within the capital programme to fund the additional spending. We have an overall budget for decarbonisation of 15 million over 10 years, of which just over 3 million is profiled for this year, where most of the overspend would arise. So we do have the capacity within the capital programme to deal with the additional costs that have come to light since we originally submitted the bid to Salix. So I hope that answers your questions, Councillor Russell, on the financial affordability of the scheme.
Thank you. Yes. Another thing that I wanted to ask about, but perhaps park this for now, is that the carbon dioxide emissions, we've got 29% that actually come from our residents' homes. So I wondered about what the thinking was between whether we decarbonise our own assets versus helping to decarbonise some of our residents' houses, and whether you'd had that discussion at all. Perhaps that's for Councillor Summersgill.
Yes, I think as been mentioned, we have a scheme to decarbonise a budget over several years to get to 2030, and these are the domestic element is a later element of that total cost.
Thank you. Right, I think that's enough from me. Has anyone indicated that they want to speak? I'll go clockwise again. So I've got Councillor Cannon, and then I've take Councillor Burke, and then I saw Councillor McKay, and nobody on that side. So Councillor Cannon.
Thank you.
Oh, sorry, Councillor Gooch.
My question is probably to Mark. So 5% is a target that we have set as a return on our investments. Can you just explain the logic behind that 5% and why 5% is set and is in our documents, and why we maintain 5% as our target?
The 5% arises from the SIP for Prudential Code, which says that any borrowing has to be affordable. Now, at the time that the budget was set, we knew that the cost of borrowing for the council was just under 3%. You then add 2% to that, representing money that you have to set aside for repayment of borrowing. If you're borrowing for 50 years, as we generally do, then 2% allows you to repay the borrowing over a 50-year period. So 3% and 2% makes 5%. So that's the ideal that allows you to repay any borrowing. But what we can also do is draw on the revenue budget if we don't achieve the 5%, and we factor that in to the projections that we present to council every year when the budget is agreed. They're called the strategic revenue projections, and that shows that if there's a call on the revenue budget for borrowing, then we can afford it. So, as I say, 5% is the ideal, but we do have a mechanism for funding schemes that don't achieve that 5% target.
Did you want to come back on any of that, Councillor Ham?
Yeah, that's all right. So, so my understanding is that it's partly because we want to cover the interest on the borrowing, and so less than 5%, there's a risk that we're not covering the interest on the borrowing. That would be my first question, and then, but we can make that up by taking from the revenue budget, which is the area of is the area that a lot of residents care about, like parking and those sorts of things. So we can take money from the revenue budget, increasing car parking or things that residents really care about, to help fund a shortfall in a project in the capital budget, because we are potentially investing in something that is less than our target and not covering the interest on the borrowing. Is that correct? No.
That's absolutely right, Councillor Cannon, but it's not something that is unique to this project. I mean, another example would be the council's affordable housing programme, where again the council knew that it wouldn't be possible to fund affordable housing just because it doesn't pay for itself. So in the same way, the council has set aside money from revenue to fund affordable housing. So it's something that is, I mean, both accepted in Mason Council and accepted elsewhere. So it's not as though we're doing anything that's out of the ordinary here in using revenue funds to help fund a capital investment like this.
Councillor Burke.
Thank you, Chair. I have several questions. I don't know how you want me to present them, if I can just go or one at a time, whatever suits everyone else. But I'll start with my first one. So on reading the report, we're looking at the annual savings of approximately, £51,000 per year. I'm just curious how you get to that figure, what assumptions were made, because it's very precise. And a very precise figure to me worries me that it's more of a guess than a factual estimate.
Yes, the figures, and I mean, they are projections, so I'm not saying that they will be exactly what materialises, but in calculating that saving, we looked at the existing costs of heating at Maidstone House, given that it's traditional gas-fired boilers, and looked at what the cost would be post decarbonisation, and that's how that savings figure was arrived at.
So an educated guess is how I interpret that. So £51,000 saving on the £2.72 million extra we need to spend, you know, and whether this is relevant or not, but for me, we're not saving much money until we hit 52 years. I just can't see how we can put that to the taxpayer. That actually, great idea, I'm all for looking at different ways of reducing things, but to say we're going to save £51,000 a year, but we're going to spend 2.72 million, I just think there's so much more we can do to change people's lives on a day-to-day basis than spending that much money over that many decades. For me, I just can't fathom how we haven't had a more in-depth conversation about it. I think it's disappointing from chatting to the residents in my street and my area when they heard about this, when there's loads of other little things we could do with that money by March 2025, without going for one big bang, sort of, this is what we're going to do, then there's so many people's lives we could change with that amount of extraordinary amount of money. And I just think it's disappointing that it's come across quite rash.
You said you had a number of questions, Councillor Berkey. Did you want to do? Yeah, might as well.
So leading on, I'm just curious around, has any analysis been conducted on the projected savings and carbon reductions and other factors that might project this? So for example, have we taken into account the change in energy prices in the future? Have we taken into account the increased usage of the building? Because you say it's going to be a more attractive place for people to come in and want to work at the house. So obviously more people using the building, it creates more emissions. Have we taken into account any sort of external factors which may change the figures that we are putting out there at the moment?
One for the Cabinet members, maybe?
Shall I just start on the factual answer to the question Cabinet members may want to add? So far as the other factors that you've mentioned, such as additional rental income, if we can make the building more attractive to tenants, none of that is reflected in the financial. So the upside, potentially, of having a modern building decarbonised, that's not reflected. The only thing that we've put into the financial projections is the thing that we can be reasonably certain of, which is that heating the building in this way will cost less in energy than it does at the moment. But I don't know if you want to add to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think Councillor Summerskill did mention the increased attractiveness of the building once it's decarbonised, and the ability to attract further tenants, and that is quite significant. What we've got in here in terms of the incomes or the savings associated with is small c conservative. So I'm expecting better than what we've got in there. That feels like a de minimis. I also think, I mean, your point around future prices is very well made, and I think the one certainty I think we can probably all agree on is that carbon fuels are not going to get cheaper in the future. So this will clearly have future benefits that none of us can really predict very well, but it's certainly going to be bigger than the 51k.
Thank you. Probably just pop in there that office buildings all over the place are struggling to find tenants because since COVID, many people are working at home, but pleased to see that wasn't actually really factored into the savings, as it were. So did you have another question, Councillor Burt?
Just a quick follow-up. So it's going to be more attractive to people to come to the building. Fine, fantastic. Also, from my point of view, if I'm looking to put a business in, I'm also looking at what's cheapest at the same time. So are we saying, because we're saving money with the solar panels, etc., is the rent for people coming in going to be lower than competitive areas? Or are we just hoping that we're going to be attractive because we've got solar panels on the roof? I'm just curious, from a business point of view, it's all about money this day and age.
Yeah, and I don't want to longer discussion about money, because actually there's a core principle here. But you're absolutely right. You know, if the cost of running the building is lower, that we will clearly pass on less costs to tenants as a result of that. Over a period of time in a rounded way. What those costs are, I'd leave to the finance and estates team. But clearly, if you move into a building that is drafty and requires a huge amount of gas to heat it, that's going to be more expensive than if you move into one that's well insulated and modern, which is why it will be more attractive. And just simply filling that space with new businesses will help the income stream.
Okay, I mean, I suggest we don't leave finance costs just to the finance and its estates team without overview, but I'm sure Councillor Jeffrey wasn't, making that point. Oh, we've got one more. Okay, fine. Councillor Burke.
Sorry, last one. And thank you very much. I think it's really good that we've passed the savings on. So what contingency plans are in place for the project if it exceeds 6.15 million? So reading the report, it doesn't say that obviously 6.15 is set in stone. I think there's still a little bit of work to do around the costing on that. And if in a case of 1 year, it's gone up substantial amounts in a year, are we perceiving, if the work doesn't begin until, let's say, for argument's sake, February 2025, if the history dictates the past, this could be in excess of 7 million. I've just wondered if we've taken any consideration of contingency plans, because we don't want to be in a position where we approve and then come January, we're now thinking, actually, we're £1 million short. So we do need to have money aside, and I would suggest at least £1 million to anticipate any rises in costs between now and March 2025.
I just mentioned there is a 10% contingency of £500,000 in there already, and the reason that costs aren't certain is because it has to go to tender, and the design stage is what's going on now, and making different elements of the design stage as economic as possible. But if you can comment on the contingency.
Yes, as is usual practice, we've built a contingency in, and during the course of the project, we'll obviously be taking steps to mitigate any possible cost increases. We have Calford Seedon, who have quantity surveyors on board who would maintaining and regularly updating a cost plan, which gives us a good oversight of what the costs are. If there are areas that look as though they're overspending, we'll obviously try and mitigate those by savings elsewhere. So we're doing everything we can to mitigate the risk, but we can't sit here and say absolutely hand on heart it's going to be a particular figure, because we're still at a fairly early stage in the project.
I mean, I think the point as well that Councillor Burke was making is that the costs have already gone up 41% since we were talking about it in March, April, that time. So if we are talking about February, it's quite liable that a 10% contingency will not be enough. So it is a point whether the Cabinet would think about having some form of a cut-off where you did say, okay, now this is too much, because this is obviously, one way or another, this is all taxpayers' money. I had Councillor McKay next.
Thank you. 12 years ago, I was elected a councillor, and I was the only Labour councillor. And so they put me on a subcommittee to discuss Maidstone House, together with a couple of other newbies, and locked us in a room. I'm not sure whether we had any suggestions, but when I asked the question, how long are we going to be here, they all laughed and said, we're only going to be here for 5 or 6 years. Our lease runs out shortly anyway. The place is falling to bits, and the heating and electricals all need replacing. So I was put in my place and I shut my mouth. Anyway, here I am, much later on, and I'm thinking, when this proposal was put before the previous Cabinet, they must have rubbed their hands in glee. What? We're collecting all this money from the government, we have to chip in a few £100,000, and we get new aircon, heating, all the windows replaced, cladding. Happy days. Yeah? And here we are, wondering or questioning, as we should in overview and scrutiny, both sides, all people should, why this has gone up. But I have an additional question to ask, really. If we didn't have the emphasis on climate change in this council, this would be brought forward under capital cost to bring our building up to date. It wouldn't be hidden in a cloak of decarbonisation. The result of replacing our heating and ventilation, windows, needed doing anyway. We knew that when we took out the leases on the building. Well, lease ownership, a lease for 179 years, is it? A long, long time. But, so, let's be honest about it, this is a sleight of hand. We are using the fact that we've got government grants under the cloak of decarbonisation, when really this is full-blooded maintenance of a building we own. And it needs to be done. And unfortunately, whoever got the first tender got it wrong. I don't know which consultancy, but there you go. So, well, I'm disappointed it didn't come in at last year's figures. I do hope it comes in at this year's figures. And I did have a short exchange with Mark Green and asked him some questions prior to this meeting. And I think in reference to one of the questions asked by Mark, I asked him if we got additional tenants in on the floors that were unoccupied. You know, which is one of the ambitions, because we're improving the building. What would be the additional income we could expect in 25, 26? And his reply was, the additional income from renting space currently vacant is conservatively estimated at £200,000. Now, Mr. Green has not included those in his expectations, but shall we say he's probably keeping that card up his sleeve in the hope that someone does come along, Mr. Green?
Thank you. Well, let's hope so, because a bird in the hand's worth two in the nest, isn't it? But the other thing is, it was a reasonable project when the Cabinet did look at it, obviously why we approved it. But I do think it requires more scrutiny now that costs have risen by 41%. And that is obviously why I've called this in and why I thought we do need to look into this. You know, it's not the value of the project in climate terms, it's the value of the project in finance terms. And I don't think you should look at one solely without the other, or indeed what else you might spend that money on. So that's really where I'm getting to with it. I mean, there has been a lot of work done on Maidstone House already, so obviously it has had a revamp. And part of the reason the costs have gone up is because I don't know about you, when I lose a couple of tiles off my roof and I want to put on solar PV, I'd take my whole roof off and then have to redo it. So, you know, costs have gone up for that reason as well. We need a new roof now to put the solar PV on. I've got Councillor Gooch next.
Thank you, Chairman. One good thing, I'm pleased to see that the pack, the previous pack in July, climate change pack, that actual report was given to Cabinet when Cabinet considered it. So therefore, Cabinet more or less knew what that pack was. And I say that because I sat on that pack, Policy Advisory Committee, forgive me. And I thought I'd just dig back. I can remember at that July Policy Advisory Committee meeting, I asked Mark Green, our wonderful finance officer, can we afford it? And he said to me, yes, it's in the budget. So I thought, as we're over in Scrutiny this evening, I'll have a little look. And sure enough, not only in the previous Policy Advisory Committee meeting, but in the budget papers for full council in February, carbon reduction to Maidstone Borough Council estate, in the year 24-25, £5.5 million. So the money is in the budget. And in fact, as Mr. Green has already pointed out, over the next 10 years, we've got about 14.5 million allowed for. So the money is physically there. And that budget was also considered along with our other aims and strategic priorities, which is your £1,000 if only, 1,000 affordable homes, subsidising those homes, and a wealth of other stuff. Which begs the question, we must have known about this extra cost by Calford Seaton before we agreed that budget in February. So my question is, when did we actually know about the extra cost, and who was it who instructed Calford Seaton? Because in the policy advisory report it said council instructed Calford Seaton. No date as to when it was they were instructed, and the council, was that officers, was that members? So can I have clarity on that, please?
I'll pass the dates over, but
it's before your time.
Yeah, the grant was finalised in February this year, so therefore Calford Seaton, I assume, were appointed after or at the time of that grant.
Yes, that's correct. Calford Seaton were appointed in May of this year. But in answer to the suggestion that we already knew that we were going to be spending more than in the Salix bid, that's not entirely the case. There was capacity within the budget, but we did need Calford Seaton's professional advice, which they've now provided, to tell us with much more confidence what the cost of the project will be. So it wasn't as though we had the detail, but we had the capacity within the budget, as you've said, when it was agreed by council in February. That means that although it's not ideal having the additional costs, we do have the budget to fund them.
Thank you, if I may please, Chairman. Yes, and in fact you've reminded me that just the fact that it's in the budget simply makes provision. It is not permission per se to actually spend up to that limit. So I take your point. And did you say it was in May that Calford Seaton were instructed? Was that before or after the election? So in other words, who actually, was it a cabinet decision or?
No, decisions of that kind can be made under delegated authority, and in fact Calford Seaton were already engaged by the council under a framework contract, because they are also the consulting engineers who work with us on our housing projects. So we didn't need to go out to do a separate procurement exercise, because there was already a contractual relationship with them.
Thank you.
Thank you. I just think that's quite an interesting and important fact, and I wish I'd have asked that question in July at that policy advisory. I would also add, I think we ought to remember that the climate change and biodiversity issue, that was triggered by residents who came to a council meeting and stood over there and demanded that the council take action, demanded that the council have a policy and do something. Now, you may be a naysayer and think, nah, there's no such thing as climate change. Even if you think that, we still need to be seen to be running our buildings efficiently. And if that involves solar panels, putting stuff up the outside, renewing windows, so be it. I don't think we have to put a label on everything, but I do think that we ought to consider that this is part of our strategic priority, and the money, the provision is there. So I think we're just short of how we actually got there. and the information that was provided. And I think that's a lesson that we could take away. I'd also want to know, how could APSI be so far out? I mean, it's quite a jump, isn't it? Have you got any feel for how they could... I asked that because recently our parish hall, we've had disabled facilities put in, and the first chap came to us and quoted about 30 odd grand. And then another chap came along and quoted us 12. So, simply because there was a different design. So I accept that these things happen, but have you got any feel as how we could have gone so far wrong, or how APSI could have been so out?
Thank you, Councillor Gooch. In Appendix 5, there's some detail of the materials that changed after APSI's review, that Calford Seedon recommended fibre cement cladding panels instead of the rendered cladding that APSI had put forward. And on the roof replacement and remedial works, a survey of the Mason House roof established the condition of the waterproofing was of concern and the material was ending its serviceable life. So it's concluded that we have to waterproof the roof of the link before we put the solar panels on it. So those are specific. It's not a 41% inflationary rise. These are technical, quite expensive technical reasons behind the change from APSI to once Calford Seedon looked at it in greater detail.
Thank you.
That's useful, thank you very much.
I watched actually the policy advisory back this morning, and I heard you refer to the project, Councillor Gooch, as the curate's egg. So I do sort of wonder whether that could be the case. Two important things, I think, is that capital provision can be made, but the money isn't there until we go and get the money from somewhere. It's not that Mark Green is sitting on a pot of millions of pounds to spend on whatever he wants. So when we go and get that capital money, whatever we get it for, there is a revenue impact on that. Hence why we do these internal rate of return calculations. So we look for 5%, we're at 1.9. I think that is salient to bear in mind. And the other thing to bear in mind is that it is decarbonisation and climate change has been given a big amount of money, rightly so. It's extremely important. The residents came into the chamber and, you know, we all carried that through. But the money can only be spent once. So whether I'm saying just the consideration of whether this is the most important thing on that whole agenda that you want to spend this amount of money on. I've got Councillor Wilkinson next.
I wanted to refute Councillor Forecast's assumption about the 1% emissions from the UK.
Thank you to Councillor Wilkinson. I'm not going to get into climate change. I think we're all sitting here and I think we do know that there's a climate change issue. We've got the climate change action plan. That is his view and he isn't here tonight.
I just wanted to say 36% of the world's countries in the world have emissions under 2%. So we all need to play our part in reducing our carbon footprint down to zero. Even the small players need to play their part. Thank you.
I think we are with the action plan, and that's, you know, ultimately why we're all here. So I don't think we need to discuss the action plan or the reasons behind that, because because of timing, and I am aware that that could potentially open into a very massive discussion, whereas I think we do need to focus down tonight on this project. And
it was just the justification of the project was that climate change wasn't really important, but it is.
And I would hope that we are councillors that do actually, you know, represent a variety of different views on a variety of different issues, and that's Councillor Forecast's, you know, viewpoint, and he's not here tonight. So I think we'll probably move on. Thank you. To Councillor Field next.
Thank you, Chair. I would just say, as the committee did allow the extraordinary indulgence of a written submission, which isn't normal procedure, that a rebuttal to that written submission is entirely fair. Okay, so from what we've heard so far, we've established that this is part of the capital programme that was agreed by full council, that it sits within budget for the capital budget assumptions, within prudential borrowing, and that the contingencies that have been assigned are within delegated responsibilities under the Council's constitution. We also know that we've had full Council resolution around the immediacy of the climate crisis. My questions really are, first of all, are Cabinet happy that they have full visibility on a live risk management process around such a large-scale project? And secondly, are there any assumptions around what would be in the capital plan that are at risk as a result of this project?
So before I come back on those questions, can I just quickly come back on Councillor Russell's point a minute ago as well, and if I could pick up both. Councillor Russell, you asked about prioritisation.
Yeah.
I mean, this was set in train July last year in terms of what's done first, and obviously we're completing that aspect, and I fully expect at some point over the coming months us to have another look at the prioritisation going forward, but at the point at which we're at, we are continuing that piece of work, so I think that is important to do. Just in terms of risk management on building, the council does building a lot. I would imagine, no, I'm certain, I'm not going to imagine, I'm certain that the appropriate risk management, the contingencies, the processes, the contracting, the tendering, etc., will be done in line with standard processes and EU regulations that we still abide by. So in those respects, the risk management will be managed in a Prince 2 way, I'm 100% certain. And then there was a third question that I've lost out of my head.
That's okay, Councillor Green.
Two things I can remember, three unstuffed.
It was around whether any other projects that may be in the capital programme were at risk as a result of this decision.
No, I don't believe it is. Clearly we've got the budget for this. There's a significant budget for the rest of the decarbonisation. I've mentioned the other aspects of capital programmes such as the council house building that's not at risk as a result of this. So my understanding is very clear that this is simply not going to impact upon the other stuff that we need to do as well.
Thank you. I suppose in terms of contribution to the debate following your answer, it does seem to me that what is at issue here is around the choice. It's not outside of financial norms. It's perfectly in line with the Council's normal procedures for budgeting, delegated responsibilities under the Constitution, and so on and so forth. I absolutely understand why it was called in, because I do agree that the papers, as were seen, did not establish what we've discussed this evening, and I confess I didn't watch the Cabinet meeting, but I understand it wasn't discussed in detail. But whilst I absolutely have sympathy for the Leader of the Council's point that there is a core principle here, the nature of the call-in being concerned with the finances, I think that it's been reasonably established this evening that this is well within the financial risk envelope that the Council has established, and that the Cabinet is within its rights under executive authority to proceed with the project as described.
I mean, the Cabinet are the ultimate controlling body of this council, so they are well within their rights to be the decision makers as per our constitution. So the other thing I'd probably say about that is we cannot move away from, we do look for 5%. This is 1.9%. We're not talking about 4.5, 4, we're down at 1.9%. So I do think, yes, within a risk envelope, but where are we taking that risk envelope to? Hence, obviously, why I called it in, but actually tonight I've heard an awful lot more. Well, it's not hard to hear an awful lot more. It was silent at the Cabinet meeting. So, and I appreciate now that some of the Cabinet members and the Leader has outlined some of the thinking behind that, and that was just missing from the Cabinet meeting. I've got one more speaker. I've got Councillor Cannon.
Thank you. At the corporate services committee. I was a member of that, and I raised a question regarding the disposal of solar panels being included in the calculation for the tonnes of CO2 saved per year. When this came to Cabinet, it says 362. The corporate services meeting was before the Cabinet meeting. So is this a new figure that takes that into account, or did you make the decision on incorrect incorrect data? Because it was identified in that meeting that the carbon saved was wrong. So I presume between there and your Cabinet meeting, you adjusted the figures and made a more correct decision, or is this still the wrong number?
Sorry, 362 comes from the net zero strategy document from last year, figure 1 in this document.
Okay, so did you take into account the disposal of the solar panels? Because that was raised, this project came in the Corporate Services Committee, and James Weld has been identified. I think Stuart was there, everyone was there who was in this meeting, said that the solar panel disposal was not included in the carbon savings of the project. And so did the Cabinet make a decision that on new data on the carbon savings, taking account of the disposal of the solar panels, or did you make a decision based on the old data, the incorrect data?
There's no solar panels being disposed of here. The discussion on the solar panels was about the SV contract, which was the other 3 locations where we were going to put solar panels in.
Sorry, I can see the confusion there. What I meant, so in the meeting, we identified that when you're calculating the benefit of solar panels, that they do have an end of life and they are then disposed, and that has an impact on their benefits for the environment because they're quite complicated to dispose of. That was identified in that meeting, and James Wildspin in that meeting said that the figures did not take account of disposal of new solar panels. So that's what I'm referring to, not the old project.
No, I understand that, but the discussion was about the other contract of the 3 places where we were going to put solar panels in, and not this one. But it can be, we will be using the same assumptions when putting the tender document together as to where the solar panels originate from and their quality, and also whether the cost, whether there's an element to be taken into account of disposal ultimately.
Thank you. And will that also consider, I know this is a bit of a side, but will that also consider where they're from and where the silica is created and those sorts of things? Because obviously we know that there are concerns around the region in China that is using a lot of slave labour to produce solar panels.
No, come on, we're ending this now. I think that we've got 3 options on the paper. I'm going to read out the options and then we're going to move towards a motion. So we've got option number 1, which is that we agree that no further action is required, so the decision will stay as on the decision in Appendix 2. We've got option number 2, which we could recommend an alternative decision to the Cabinet to consider, or we've got option number 3, which is we could recommend that the decision be reviewed by full council. I'm reaching around option number 2 just with the words of the actual appendix, the decision that was made. First of all, actually, I think we should take out the bit about the SELEC funding for floor 4 because no one's commented on that at all tonight. So can I just take it that the committee's agreed that that decision stands, that they spend the SELEC funding of the £300,000 on floor 4 of Maidstone House? Is that agreed with everybody? Agreed. Okay, so that's off the table. And then the remainder is the money for the main decarbonisation and the Maidstone's 2.7233464, very precise, contribution towards that. around option number 2, I just wonder whether we could refer it back to the Cabinet in order that some of the things that they've said tonight in the further detail be republished in a full paper set so that we've got a good decision trail for this decision going forward. And my other point would be that if the amount of money were to go over the 10% contingency fund, that would come back to Cabinet for another reconsider, because I think it's a blank check. Otherwise, we could go millions more, and at the end of the day, construction costs do have a habit of going up and going up considerably. And I think then I do think this is a worthwhile project. My worry is that it's not an open-ended cash book when there are other priorities. So I wonder, could you maybe ask whether that be a possibility that you set the 10% contingency as a ceiling?
We do quarterly financial reporting, so it doesn't need to go back to Cabinet particularly with that figure. It's dealt with in the quarterly finance meeting.
Okay, well, is anyone moving for a motion then? Councillor Field?
Thank you, Chair. Again, I understand where you're coming from, but I'm afraid I don't agree that there's anything further to be gained for council taxpayers by the Cabinet reassessing things that, with all due respect, Mr. Green is going to repeat are within the council's set budget, his delegated authority, and the agreed budget for capital scheme.
Are you moving to a motion then?
So I would say that motion would be option 1.
Seconded by anyone? Seconded by Councillor McKay. So, okay, so votes on option 1. Can I take those 4? Got it. And votes against? And no abstentions. That vote is carried. So that was the main substantive item on this agenda, and with that I draw this meeting to a close. Thank you, everybody.